Is love your neighbor a political statement? Are high prices corporate greed or government taxes? Is Twitter's rebrand to X the future of communication? We tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the internet and we find takes that either really rock or really don't, and we break down what's interesting about them and offer our own perspective. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to like and share and comment. All that good stuff helps us out a ton. You can follow us on socials, which are available on the screen, or if you are listening, that's Good Take Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, let's get into our first take, which comes from Libertarian in Chief on Twitter, now X, actually, which we'll address later in this episode. And he tweets, or X's, I guess, would you pay $15,000 for a used car that is on sale at the dealership next door for $7,250? Then why should an employer pay you $15 an hour if there are people willing and able to do your job for $7.25 an hour? What do you think about this one, Brett?
This is a great take. It's a little bit simplistic, but I think that actually lends itself to why it's good, because I think everyone can understand the scenario that when you go car shopping, it's a purely distributive decision in calculus. It's I want to get the best car for the least amount of money, and that type of decision making applies everywhere in the market, regardless of whether or not you've got floors or ceilings. People are going to always try and figure out what the best service or best price or best commodity or best employer or best employee they can get for the least amount of cost to them. And it's just classic supply and demand, and that also applies to labor as well. And so I like how that illustrates that a very distributive calculus. And I think that he might have been able to expand upon it a little more, where it's that when you set a price floor and you make it so that employers have to pay a certain amount of money, it means that they also have to require a certain amount of value to be taken or to be generated by whatever employee they have, which means that you cut out any potential for people that are less skilled but are willing to work for less money simultaneously in order to gain skills and further up the row. So people that I think about The Pursuit of Happiness, the documentary, and I can't remember the guy, but he was pretty smart, but he didn't know the tools of the trade for stock trading. But he was able to get in and keep moving up as an unpaid internship. That similar sort of deal. I'm not saying that's like the best example, but that similar sort of thing where someone wants to gain skills by trading, a high hourly pay for working with someone that is highly skilled. You eliminate that possibility because now there's a floor, and you can't, as we talked about before, if you are not generating, $10 worth of burgers every hour, they're not going to be able to pay you $11 an hour, right? They're losing $1 an hour that you work at that company. So by setting price floors and price ceilings, you hurt the market, you hurt employees.
Yeah, the other thing about this that's good is that it does make a relation, and he doesn't stress it too much, but by necessity of understanding what he's saying, you kind of realize that the relationship between you paying for a car in this example for paying 15,000 or 725, you are in a similar position in a sense as an employer who's paying an employee. You are both paying an external party for a good or a service. And in the case of buying the car, you are purchasing that car. It's a one-time payment. But in the example as an employer, you are paying an individual for their work and their service. And so I think a lot of the times people think about companies and employers as these islands of economics that are off in the distance, and they in no relation to you as a worker or you as a individual who goes grocery shopping. I don't understand why these business owners can't pay their employees more. And then you go to the grocery store and you do the exact same thing, where you put the exact kind of decision making in your own life applicable that an employer does regarding his employees. In the same way, like you could expand on this example. When you go to the grocery store, if you see one brand of orange juice, and then the next one that's on sale, and they're both equally good brands of orange juice, you're going to choose the one that is more economically efficient for you. So you're being put in the exact same position as the employer. And of course, in that scenario, you would think, oh, well, it would be ridiculous for me to pay more for the same thing when this is on sale. That that doesn't make any sense for my budget. And similarly, an employer has to think about budgets and make sure that they have profit. Now, of course, the biggest difference that this take doesn't quite address is that there's sort of a misconception that all business owners are these massive corporations that will generate just excess revenue and profits for their executives that is unnecessary and unneeded, and all businesses are flush. When you can't make the exception the rule. There are some businesses that disproportionately pay executives high amounts that maybe they don't all earn that, right? We know a lot of corporations don't put in their work. They make phony deals. They stay afloat artificially through laws and anti-competitive practices. But but the vast majority of businesses that these regulations would hit the hardest are the ones who are operating on a budget, just like you if you're grocery shopping, or you when you're car shopping. In the same way that you have a limit and you have to make the best financial decision for you or your family or your budget, so do these businesses. Most businesses are not just flush and rife with cash. And ironically, the people who want to raise the minimum wage are the mega corporations who can't afford that because they have all of that flexibility. So these people need to recognize, like, when you go and buy something like a car, or again everyday groceries, you are putting yourself in the same shoes as a lot of these businesses are doing, with their own scale of how much they're paying their labor.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, economies of scale are they are only created once you've had time to reinvest in infrastructure, machinery, processes, and tools that make employees able to generate more value per hour that they are working. For example, Amazon, like you were bringing up, at the beginning when they were working in the warehouses and stuff, they had to pay pretty low wages because they are a low margin business. Everything wasn't very streamlined yet. Nothing was super efficient. They didn't have the crazy warehouses that were automated and all this stuff. So that any warehouse employee that you had working in there was really only able to generate maybe even negative amounts of dollars per hour in terms of the actual contained products. But maybe as overall business, they were a little bit profitable. But as they've automated and invested in the infrastructure, when you drive to Spokane here in Washington, you'll drive by these massive Amazon warehouses that have all these floor robots and do these crazy things and make it possible for an employee that 10 years ago, employee today could do what an employee could do in a day, what would take a month for an employee 10 years ago. So some just really awesome things like that. And when you set price floors really high, you actually slow down that investment. You make it harder for people to eventually get paid more because at the end of the day, if this is just a pure calculus of how much value and resources are generated, the only way for everyone to get better is for everyone to be more productive. And the only way for there to be more production is for there to be more excess resources to be put into infrastructure and investment. And when you set those price floors, you're chopping away at that. You're making it really. You're making the time horizon a lot longer for businesses to actually get to that point. There's a reason why when you're a startup or anything like that, basically everyone works for free, right? They are banking on the future that things are going to get better. And that plays a little bit to the employees that are working at a place that is low margin but trying to invest back in. But it's all an economic calculus, and you and I both believe that people should be free to choose and make that calculus on their own, not have the government make it for them.
Yeah, the last to illustrate your point, just because it, it rings a similarity to me, and anyone who's a dorky gamer like me, well, maybe not everyone who is, but maybe a subset will relate to here. I've been playing a remake that just released of Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life, and so I'm thinking about like crops and planting. So we're not going to go to Coconut Island as we are off to do. We'll stick to farming. But it's you think about like in those games, you start with a base amount of money, and you could go out and buy something cool in the game. Like you could go to the bar and like buy all the drinks you want. Then you don't have any money to invest. Or you can buy seeds. And then once you plant those seeds, you get crops. Now you could sell all of those crops right away, make a profit. That's great. Or what you can do is you can upgrade the quality of those crops over time and then turn them back into more seeds. So you don't get the money right away, but you're long term building up. So you're going to have higher quality crops. You're going to have a higher quality yield, and down the road, your next yield is going to be even higher. And so the idea there is, you get this sense of delayed gratification and all that. But if you artificially increase the cost, like when you use the seed maker, you get 2 bags of seeds for every crop you put in there. But let's say you were like, no, actually, you now need to put in 2 crops to get 2 bags of seeds. You've now artificially made it so that it's going to take even longer to turn over those profits that you're talking about, because now you have to use up more of the revenue that you have on hand, more of that liquid asset, and you have to use that to produce the same result. You haven't actually increased the amount of productivity. And what that means is that even though in the short term, you might be requiring, in the real world example, employees, you're giving them a little bit more cash. In the long term, you've slowed the overall production down so that by the time in the uninhibited timeline, you would be producing, mounds and mounds of these of profits and crops, and everyone benefits from that. When the company does well, employees are able to rise through the ranks and get paid higher. You've slowed that process down so the company doesn't grow as big, so then paychecks for employees don't grow as big either. And then that's, not to even mention sort of the ramifications of setting that wage across all industries, which just ends up adding to inflationary realities. Okay, our next take here, I think it comes from Instagram, or maybe I'm
Yeah.
based on the icons here. Yeah, and this one I'm not familiar with the user, but they're verified. It's Carlos Happy NPO, um, and he writes, "Love your neighbor," end quote, is a political statement and a biblical one. Welcome the stranger, end quote, is a political statement and a biblical one. Feed the hungry, end quote, is a political statement and a biblical one. Put away your sword, end quote, is a political statement and a biblical one. So, what do you think, Britt? What's the message? What's the takeaway here?
This is such a bad take, and it's really deceptive in the way that it's framed, because I don't think Jesus ever talked about these things in the context of a political statement. And these people will merge the thought of, if you don't believe in this type of government or this type of political philosophy, then you are not moral. And so they kind of reverse engineer and start at the end and work backwards, as opposed to trying to build a logical and coherent worldview, a biblical worldview. And this guy's a pastor and an evangelist, quote unquote. And so they'll start with, well, Jesus said that we need to feed people, so therefore the political ideology that says, oh, we're going to feed people is the good one, without any thought behind, whether or not Jesus actually meant that from a political standpoint, much less whether or not that political ideology, does what it actually purports to do, what it says to do. And that's also kind of the issue with socialism, is it operates under the veil of, oh, we're helping people, while limiting choice by taking away people's agency, by actually making things inefficient and harder to practically solve a lot of these issues. So it's a really deceptive way to go about it. I think we've had a meme on in one of our past episodes on Cringe Post, where it was like, basically, Jesus saying, hey, feed the hungry and feed the poor. And then someone goes, oh, well, don't you mean make the Romans, make my neighbor do it, not me? And Jesus goes, oh, well, let me start again. I'm going to say it again, because he's talking to the individual. He always is speaking to the individual level. Jesus talks to believers maybe on a group level. And I think this would become a good take if it was, love your neighbor is a church statement and a biblical one, right? If you're part of a church that is not loving your neighbor, if you're part of a church that is not welcoming the stranger, or not feeding the hungry, or working in the community on a voluntary basis, then yeah, you're not actually part of a biblically based church, because that is commanded of it. But it is not commanded for you to go from a Christian standpoint. It's not commanded for you to go vote in people that take money away from your neighbor and give it to someone that you deem worthy. I mean, that is just a complete misreading, misinterpretation, and at best, and at worst, it's just pure deception.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what's frustrating too is that the even the very definitions of these phrases matter on the context. It's not like you can read the phrase "love your neighbor" and understand the exact context and meaning of it. Now, sure, you can grab a general meaning, and there is a general meaning of love, but it always becomes more complicated and nuanced and difficult. Would, for instance, Carlos recognize the idea of tough love? Because if that's the case, then you actually have two very different political realities depending on how you're going to interpret the reality around you. And if your interpretation of love your neighbor is support them in whatever they do, never challenge them, give them conflict free pass on whatever, then your response to, say, I don't know, transgendering children, but at the age before they are able to conceive of what that even means, is going to be different than understanding loving your neighbor can mean stopping them from doing something that is destructive, harmful, and ultimately irreversible to themselves. And so even in that context, it's frustrating because you're saying, "Oh, it's a political statement." And it's like, well, sure, it can be a political statement, but the context Jesus is writing in is not a political statement. It is a lifestyle statement. And the political ramifications ought to come out of a Christian worldview. I agree with that actually. I think that a culture that does not have these virtues is doomed to immorality and to destruction, which I think is the path we're kind of on right now. But the idea then, if all of your messages here are saying these things are political and biblical statements, then one, he's got to commit to saying that every law needs to be biblically backed, or maybe rather than that, saying every biblical commandment ought to be politically backed. So I'm very much looking forward to him resurrecting, some of the Old Testament law, ceremonial or otherwise. I mean, even non-ceremonial law, which I don't think he would be in favor of some of the laws that would be commanded. Um, but also it's just obvious that some of the things that were commanded in the Bible do it to demonstrate a grander point and a more a principle and a philosophy, not the opposite of a political statement. Like for instance, when he says, gouge out your eye that causes you to sin, because it's better to be blind than for your eye to cause you to sin. Obviously the point there is hyperbole, and it's a lifestyle statement. It's not a political statement to say, okay, this is the punishment for lusting, is gouge out offenders' eyes. So clearly context matters in these. And so when you want to cherry pick these things and then apply your specific political framing to them, you can't cherry pick. You actually have to take everything if that's going to be your guiding philosophy, which I think, as we know, is not his actual guiding philosophy.
Yeah, to add on to your point, these statements and the political ideology that this guy ascribes to, because he's very much a socialist, the actual implementation of whatever political ideology and connected to these statements and his interpretation of them would actually in a lot of ways move people further away from what God's design is, because all of these commandments, I mean, it talks about it in Romans 15, how we are given the law. And I know this is very Christian, maybe for our audience, but like Johnny and I are Christians, and it's the most important thing in our lives. So we're going to talk about it. But the whole reason you are given the law is so that you have something to measure against. And it's clear that we don't measure up to it, right? Because we all have fallen and all fallen short and live short of the glory of God. But that law illuminates our need for Christ. And by coming to Christ, now we can, through the freedom of his son and sacrifice, actually live up to it, live a life that is redeemed and is by design to that. And a lot of these types of political ideologies that he would implement would push people further away from that. It incentivizes envy. It incentivizes not taking responsibility. It incentivizes greed. It incentivizes, and they would make the same argument about capitalism, but it incentivizes greed without any possibility of redemption in that, right? People are not incentivized by greed and the outcome of that greed is to actually produce good things for people. People are just greedy and want to take as much as they can without producing anything. So this does not result in a world that more resembles heaven, does more resembles the kingdom of God. It actually leaves people without any rudder. It makes them not have to grapple with the reality of their condition and makes them point towards another type of God, which in his case, and in this case, would be government. It makes them ultimately view it that way, instead of looking to God as the moral giver and us as the people that can receive that and through the redemption of his son be changed.
Absolutely right. I think that's spot on. Okay, we've got a tweet or an X from Martha Bueno, who says, "How many taxes are on each loaf of bread you buy? Let's start with the grain. The land it was grown on pays taxes. The farmer pays taxes to buy, lease, and own all farm equipment. He pays taxes on each employee. He pays taxes when he sells his crops to the processing plant, who in turn pays taxes for the land, building, all equipment, all employees, plus on every dollar he makes when he sells his flour to the baker. The baker must pay taxes on his building, equipment, and employees. He then ships the finished product, gas tax, from one processor to the next, and government increased the cost of that one product by quite a bit. But you're going to tell me it's the fault of the greedy corporations that prices are high? When is government greed ever discussed? Seems to me they have the biggest pockets of all. What do you think?
This is a fantastic take. I love how simplified she makes it, and then how she just completely expands, because people don't think about the actual cost that goes into a product, and every cost that goes into a product has a tax attached to it, because there's some sort of transacting of money in between it. We've used this example before, but if you have a dollar, how many exchanges of that dollar before the entire value, quote unquote, of that dollar is taxed? It's like, well, when I take that dollar, and let's just say it just appears out of nowhere and it's in my hand, and I pay it to someone to do something for me, right off the bat, X amount of percentage for employee taxes taken, maybe even state taxes. Then that person uses to buy a good, and then that good is taxed with sales tax, and then that business uses that money to pay their employee, and so on and so forth. And it's like, oh, well, within about 5 to 10 transactions, the entire value of that dollar has been taxed. And that's why the percentage of the ratio of total taxes collected to GDP basically stays about the same every year, because it's really attached to the velocity of money, how fast money is moving through the economy. The faster it moves, the more it's taxed. That's why they always want to have more and more money being moved through. They want to be able to make it easy for banks to loan you money. They want capital to move, because if money is not moving, they are not making revenue. And that was one of the primary reasons why interest rates were always kept so low. Not only because it inflated, what we thought was a really good economy, and kept housing prices, going up, and all these different things, and infinite growth, but it also made it so that it was easy to spend money because there was a lot of it. And the more of it there is, the more the government can get. So their entire revenue strategy is based on how fast they can make things move, not that they can actually create things that, and this also, influences, and this is where I was trying to go with it. This influences the type of products we build, right? People will talk about, and boomers will talk about, well, when I bought a refrigerator in 1940 or 1950, it lasted forever and I still have it. It's like, yeah, built-in obsolescence is a aspect of this type of economy where your dollar that you make a year ago is worth less today. And so all of these things work together to make it so that we have not as good of products. The dollar that we get can't be actually saved, and it continues to get chipped away at. And at the end of the day, everything that you've worked for means less and less and less. So the work you do today in 40 years is basically going to be worthless, right? Even if you save it, because of the rate of inflation. I think it's at an inflation rate of like 4%. In about 40, 50 years, the entire value of whatever you've saved today is gone. So yeah, that's all. I'll leave it at that and let you go.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic breakdown, and highlighting the mechanics of this post totally. So I'll kind of take the last maybe lower hanging fruit, which is you're talking about the greedy corporations, and why is government greed never discussed, and the latter half of this made me think of something that's very close to me right now as I work in Washington state policy, which is the high gas prices that are caused by this carbon tax that our governor had our legislature implemented, and our governor had proposed and signed a few years ago, that just got implemented this year. So for those of you unaware, sort of the too long didn't read, is right now Washington state has the highest gas prices in the nation, and that is due to a jump at the start since the start of the implementation of a cap and invest is what it's called, but it's cap and trade program, where basically the government now requires any big companies and refineries that are emitting carbon into the atmosphere, they have to buy a carbon credit for that, and they only sell so many carbon credits at an auction. So based on the prices of the demand and the amount bought by different producers of the carbon in the atmosphere, the price is going to adjust, and then those refineries, of course, have to adjust their prices based on this new tax that they paid on the price of carbon. Washington Policy Center used very normal calculations based on other states like California's math, and we, using their data, said, hey, this is going to bump the price by, if their projections are correct, it's going to bump the price by 45 cents per gallon. The governor, everyone said, no, it's only going to be pennies. That's ridiculous. That's goofy. And sure enough, the cap and trade auctions happened, and Washington prices went up by about 45 cents, just like we had predicted, right? So now between that and the state taxes on gas, which is like another 49 cents, Washington is collecting about 93 cents per gallon of gasoline that you buy. Washington state is collecting about that in tax, or the government is. And so what was really funny is, now that the prices are real in here, defenders of this carbon tax are pointing at everyone else. They're saying it's the oil companies, they're being greedy. And the governor and another senator and a group called Climate Solutions that promoted this were citing this chart of data that was saying, look, it's these greedy oil companies. They're making 80 cents on every gallon of gasoline. They're making 80 cents per gallon off of you. And that is just ridiculous. Now, the really funny thing is the chart and the data they cited, our researcher went and found, and the group that made that data said, no, that's not what the data says at all. That we don't know how much that the oil companies are making off that. That this is just the sort of a net thing. It's not a profit at all. So
Yeah.
they were completely wrong in citing that data. And now they flip flop say, oh, there's no transparency in pricing. We don't know how much they're making, even though a week ago they were saying we know exactly how much and it's 80 cents and it's too much. But the funny thing is, okay, let's assume that it was 80 cents per gallon. So that is oil company greed. But the 93 cents that the government is taking somehow is totally fine and acceptable, especially when you implement half of that on this carbon thing, and none of that new carbon tax, the 45 cents, is even going back to the roads that, allegedly gas taxes are supposed to be used for to repair. So it's just this absolute hilarious double standard. It'd be hilarious if it didn't make me want to cry, of people saying, look at these greedy oil companies. They're collecting 80 cents per gallon. Also, don't look at the fact that the government is taking, like 10% more than that for a fact. And as of course, the oil companies weren't even taking that much. We don't know generally, but that's probably not in the range. So it just highlights, this latter part where they talk about they're always blaming greedy corporations for these high prices, but the government greed is never discussed, even though they're taking more. And it's not even just that, right? I think as you demonstrated, it's not only that they take more, it's that they implement the systems and the causes and effects that cause things to get more expensive, whether that's through, you know, incentivizing things that are going to print more money and have money moving so that they're collecting more taxes, or just from limiting supply, like shutting down the world and COVID, and then preventing people from making things, and then flooding the world with money. And then you're just going to have price increases because you had people stop making things. So either they're directly responsible through increased taxes and taxation, or through the policies that cause things to not be able to be as efficient or made well.
I don't have any more on this one.
All right, we'll move on to our next tweet here from Hannah Cox, who says the historic lesson of COVID will be that ordinary people committed and encouraged crimes against humanity out of fear, ignorance, and arrogance. But this time around, we will have a lot of them on record thanks to social media and technology. What do you think about this?
It's a good take, and I think we align more with Hannah Cox ideologically than not. I'm doubtful about whether there will be an historic lesson on COVID, though. In general, we'll see. It seems like everyone and the people that are in charge of writing the history books, at least, all fall on one side of this issue. So it depends on kind of how that goes. And I mean, there's kind of a meme running around about the COVID stuff that, like, oh yeah, we all now doubt that the good guys have always won throughout history, right? Like it's the Norm Macdonald bit about how, yeah, what a convenient and lucky thing, the good guys always win, in every battle. And maybe it's just the fact that whoever is controlling and writing the history books and conquers is out and has a vested interest in making themselves look like the good guys. In some ways, though, they've lost, and like Hannah Cox was saying, we do have the internet, which is great, but it is kind of terrifying that they are trying to scrub it. That politicians like Fauci and others will, I guess Fauci's not a politician, but the equivalent, will go on and say things like, oh no, I never advocated for shutting down schools. I never advocated for lockdowns. I just made recommendations. And they kind of gaslight and change things. And people who aren't paying attention, who didn't have a nice, solid, amount of attention throughout the entire aspect and the entire ordeal, are going to be a little bit deceived by it. So it's up to people, on social media to continuously bring it up and not let any of these folks off the hook. And that's why I appreciate, public figures like Rand Paul and Thomas Massie and other politicians who did fall on the right side of the issue right from the beginning, held people's feet to the fire all the way through the entire ordeal, and then are continuing to push for it and do so even after it is no longer politically expedient to do so. I think that's really important for us to not let people forget that. I mean, we've done that with other things in our history. And I think this is something that's important as well. What's terrifying about it, again, is that there are people that are really powerful that have a lot to lose. And they don't want the history books to look at them like this, much less people of today that could potentially put them in jail or much worse.
Yeah, I think the The interesting thing here is that while there are people who are trying to change the narrative and gaslight, like you mentioned, the there's almost this whole subset of people who went along with that narrative, who were just normal citizens, like this, post mentions, but they're not as good at covering their tracks, and so to some degree, there will be a lot of gaslighting, there will be a lot of revisionism, but there will be receipts from just careless people who tweeted stuff out, who wrote things on social media, who shared articles and things that didn't go back and delete or change, and they can be held accountable. I mean, I think some of that is not specifically with COVID necessarily, but a lot of that is being done when you look at either libs of TikTok or Defiant L's or anything where it's these contradictory posts of yeah, I'm saying one thing, but only 2 years ago I said the complete opposite kind of thing. And so I wonder if the historic lesson of COVID will be that, not in the mainstream way, but the fact that there is more and more alternative media, more and more alternative access to real information, not the constructed narrative. And maybe that means there is a great fragmentation in society that I think we're seeing now already, and maybe it gets even bigger there. But at that point, I think we do at least have a subset of the population, if not hopefully the majority, who do learn the historic lesson of COVID as she describes it. But I do agree with you that I do think that there will be a lot of this revisionist history from the official narratives, from the official, acceptable publications and colleges and publications and things like that. So it will be interesting to see which wins out. But the broader picture is, I think that even for her to have a semblance of being right here, it's all been thanks to the free exchange of
Yes.
technological communication, and I don't think that that can be overstated. People are worried about misinformation. People are worried about censorship, but all of I think the net result of the digital age, at least politically, has probably been a net good. It has been a way that, sure, there's a million voices, but that means that dissenting voices can be out there. And sure, some might get squashed, but obviously a cultural backlash happened enough to try to reverse some of that trend. I would say that cancel culture as a theme or verbiage probably is not as bad as it was at one point. And some of that's because maybe Elon Musk bought Twitter, whether or not that's a totally good decision, we'll discuss in a bit here. He's not perfect at it by any means, but I mean, that was even just almost a rallying point for people to say, hey, there's hope, there's a chance. And so even that is trended, I would say, in a better direction. So maybe the internet isn't this evil thing, and maybe we shouldn't regulate it to bits, like maybe some Republicans want to do.
Well, I was just thinking about how about 6, 7 months ago, I was talking with some folks that are close to me, and they had gotten the vaccine, and I was like, "Hey, didn't they now that all this data's come out, we know for sure that it doesn't work. Like, don't you think it's kind of silly that they lied to you, all this time because they were saying it did and they knew it didn't work?" And these folks were saying like, "Oh no, no, we always knew it didn't work. We just got it because it was supposed to improve our, whatever our chances are." I said, "Well, that's not what they were saying. So I don't know where you got that thought or that idea that it didn't prevent you from transmission or from getting it." Uh, and that was what the great thing about the internet was. I was able to pull up specifically here in Washington State that Jay Inslee and crew knew. I think it was in July of 2021 that there was a super spreader event from an all vaccinated group from Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. And they had literally said like, "Hey, we've been saying that this prevents infection and transmission. What do we do?" And the email showed that, they said, "Let's stay the course and just keep saying it because we want people to get vaccinated." So that at least like just even 30 years ago, right? We wouldn't have that ability. Not even though the internet existed in some form or function, we didn't have the ability to save and decentralize all these different data silos. We didn't have the ability with a cell phone to capture, firsthand video evidence of these things. So that it is a great thing that we've got that. Now there stands a chance. I might not be able to persuade these people of it, but anyone that is watching the argument with at least an open mind and that can be persuaded, it's like, well, the evidence is right there in front of your eyes and we've got it. And the internet makes that possible, whereas before you didn't. And again, like it really makes you question the history just of all things, because you realize what people in power will do to maintain in power, how they will change, history and rewrite things and squash dissenters and people. So it really, I mean, you and I have a pretty pessimistic view of any sort of person in authority and how they do stuff. So that kind of naturally falls out of us. But I would love to go back in the time machine and see what actually the perceptions and the vibe, for lack of a better word, was during a lot of these different historic moments.
Thank you for apologizing for your use of the word vibe there, because when people use vibe, it actually not in every context, but it feels like the word that people use when they can't think of anything and they use it over and over again. It's a new filler word, so I appreciate that. Okay,
Yeah.
moving on to our next post here. This is our last take. This one comes from Mike Cernovich, and this is on the heels of Twitter being rebranded to X. X as Twitter rebranding is coming as jarring to some. Pause. Consider this. 2+ decades ago, Elon started a payment company with a bizarre and impossible idea. What if people could pay each other via email? Today, we consider that obvious, yet PayPal, which X merged into, struggled to gain customers. They were even giving new users $25 in affiliate cash to sign up their friends. Twitter is the past. It started off as a podcasting service. Isn't that interesting? They were too early to podcasting to win, so they pivoted. Twitter became a sort of way to issue press releases from celebrities. Early innovators like Shaq saw the value and realized you could super connect with fans. 5 Lakers tickets if you can meet me at this corner, go. Dana White and the UFC used this model as well to great success. Unfortunately, the left and regime propagandists learned Twitter was a way to create narratives, including false ones like Russiagate or organized riots, as they did in Ferguson. Some of us, Pasoibik, Cernovich, Cassandra, Tim Pool, saw Periscope and with its connection to Twitter as the preeminent way to capture and stream live news. The DNC 2016 coverage and footage was historical. Twitter then let, I'm not actually sure of this word, let's see, let apparatchiks, maybe, take over. Narrative over truth was the heavy hand. Our beloved bird site became a canary in the coal mine for free speech. X is the future of communication. More than a group text, X is human consciousness in text form in real time. Twitter is dead. Long live X. Okay, what do you make of this take?
It's not immediately clear what he thinks X is, and I've really struggled to. I've really struggled to understand, based on Linda, whatever her name is, and Elon Musk's tweets, to understand what X is. It really kind of seems like one of those like corpo meme videos where they say all this jargon and say that this is going to change the world, and you're like, I really still don't know what you actually do. If I guess I'm reading between the lines, I mean, maybe X is the vision of what Elon Musk thinks Twitter can do to speed up ideas around the world, with true free speech and all that. It's what's confusing to me about that is I don't think he really something that crazy, that world changing has to also be fairly extreme. And I don't feel like Elon Musk has taken a very extreme approach to free speech on Twitter or any aspect of it. The stream of consciousness that Cernovich is kind of alluding to, human consciousness in text form. It's like, well, in order for that to be there, like it has to be unfiltered, right? Like
Yeah.
at the base level, things just pop into your brain, and they could be good or they could be bad, and they could be crazy. And that is what human consciousness is, and he apparently doesn't let that happen. I don't actually know if that would be a good thing or not. I lean towards it not being a good thing, and I don't
Yeah.
really like some of the words that he's using about X. So we'll see. This could just be hype stuff, but I mean, if anyone backs up hype, it really is Elon Musk, right? Like he's like, oh, we're going to launch this thing into space, or I'm going to build this big tunnel under LA. Like he kind of does stuff. So I'll be curious to see how it goes. From a Christian standpoint, it just kind of, to me, I get skeptical and hesitant about anything that purports to be like the next stage of human evolution, or this is going to change the world and make us all better people. So anytime those type of words are used, it's like I don't, either it's sinister or it's obtuse to me.
Yeah, the funny thing about this post is it feels like he starts out saying, "Hey, some people were shocked by X or Twitter being rebranded to X." He says a bunch of irrelevant things and then he says X is the future of communication. And you're like, "What? Where did that come
Yeah.
from?" Sure, you described sort of the evolution of what Twitter was. You're not saying why this rebranding is good. And the funny thing to me is that through all of this, he demonstrates that in the different evolutionary cycles, Twitter's brand remained consistent. And so I think a lot of people's problem isn't what Elon Musk wants Twitter or what X to be. From my understanding, and I could be off here, but my understanding is Elon has had this idea and he's talked about wanting to have sort of the West's WeChat. If you're not familiar with WeChat, it's a Chinese application that does kind of everything. It's their social media, it's their primary form of like texting, like how we might use WhatsApp. It is their payment system, like a PayPal or Venmo. It's just kind of the all-in-one app. And from my understanding, he wants X to be that. And I think he wants to turn Twitter into that. Now, whether or not that's a good thing, the rebranding, I think, is what people are taking issue with. And there's a whole lot that can be said about that rebranding. First and foremost, Twitter is one of the most recognizable brands in the world. And so the fact that you're just throwing that away is crazy. And I think that's the first thing. Second, X is a terrible brand name. It really is. It introduces all kinds of problems. First and foremost, well, I mean, I already mentioned Twitter is the most recognizable, and the fact that you're not starting X as your everything except for Twitter app. Like my thought is, if you want to make this everything app, start introducing X branded things, right? Start X payment or like X pay, and then do X social or something, or X whatever, X chat. Do all of those things. I mean, that even sounds bad, which is part of the problem. But let's, you say what you want, start introducing X, and then transition Twitter slowly into X and merge them. But right now, doing this transition, you're saying we're changing what Twitter is, but you haven't produced any of the things to back that up. The fact that you're just rebranding it and you're trying to make it this revolutionary thing without giving any of the new features of it, that is the primary problem.
Yeah.
It's how I think Facebook did it right. Facebook's service, Facebook, is still called Facebook because that's one of the most recognizable brands. The company is called Meta because they want to move into that direction. And even if they eventually want to make Facebook the metaverse, they were smart to not do that too early so that they keep the Facebook branding and then they normalize the idea of things being called Meta, like the Meta Quest or, the Meta Spaces and all that kind of thing. So that's, to me, is the first problem. Did you want to shoot in here before I continue? I've got so many thoughts on this.
No, continue. Keep going.
Okay.
I like hearing you.
So the second major problem is the just the actual branding of X. So let's talk about that. First of all, it's terrible for SEO. And what I'm saying here, I'm not pretending that this is my unique insight. This has been pointing out by a lot of people. And I don't love bandwagoning on the hate train just because it's Musk or just because it's so unpopular or just because it's change. But I genuinely have tried to think about this from a positive standpoint, and I cannot find any benefit to the X branding. It is terrible for SEO. Searching X, the naming conventions, sure, Twitter and tweeting and retweeting is silly, but the fact is you have the most recognizable brand and it's become part of the nomenclature of the US. Like, our language recognizes those things. And he's saying that literal messages on X are going to be called X's. So now you're saying I'm going to go to X to X and X. That's so unbelievably stupid. Here's so from an SEO perspective, terrible. Second, and really important, X is terrible because X is very much associated with adult content. Now, one of the things that Twitter has been doing recently, and I think is part of their merge to being the all-in-one app, is highlighting and uplifting their video services. So, for instance, Tucker Carlson has launched a show on Twitter exclusively uploading their Daily Wire's uploading their videos. So Twitter videos has become really big. Well, now what are they called? They're not Twitter videos, they're X videos. X video happens to be the single largest pornographic website in the world. Okay, so now if you want to upload a video on X.com, you have now made an X video. And how is that going to be defined? It's going to be terrible. So from that perspective, all of this is terrible. Now, why am I talking about this? None of this was brought up in this take. That's the problem with this take. None of what he's talking about here addresses the actual problems people have. If people were saying, I don't think X is going to innovate enough, or man, I don't think X, the idea of X is a good one in the right way, then this take would make sense. That is not what I've seen in 99% of people complaining about this rebranding. They're talking about it as a brand, as a communication platform. He actually tried to name PayPal X back in the day, and his co-founders and board were like, "No, that's terrible. Don't do that. That's stupid." And the fact is, he bought Twitter, and now he has it so he can do this. But everyone's advised against it because I think from an actual marketing and logistics perspective, it is just an objectively bad one, unfortunately.
Yeah, I enjoy your entire takedown of it. The only thing I'll add on to it is that I saw someone tweet about like which of these favicons is not an adult content site, and it's like the only one on there. I think there's like 9 listed. The only one is the new X by Elon Musk favicon. Everything else, like it's universally known as
Yeah.
the symbol for adult content. And I think even his mother, May Musk, like she tweeted out something and she had 3 X's like
Oh.
to emphasize the name or whatever. But it's like, yeah, that triple X is universally known as that's where you go for adult content. So I don't. But here's the thing: you and I, we live in houses that we purchased with a mortgage, and we work at companies and we do fairly well for ourselves. We're not a billionaire, right? So
Right.
maybe there's something going on here that is the literally 4D, 5D, 6D chess that we don't know what's going on. And I'll be pleasantly surprised to see that occur and to have my mind blown, as I have my mind blown by Elon Musk a lot, right? Like he does some pretty crazy things, but at face value, I mean, it's really hard to see what angle he's going at with this because it just seems like, I don't know. In his words, the most entertaining outcome is the most likely, and maybe that's what he's going for, right? This is somewhat entertaining for it to be this way, but who knows?
I agree. I do want to take a grain of salt. Like I said, I don't like hopping on the everyone thinks this train. I like being a contrarian, not for its own sake, but because usually people like to get into groupthink. To me, the thing that really seals the deal is the fact that you're getting rid of the Twitter branding. That to me seems
Yes.
like the biggest hole in all of this. Because, like I said, if he started by everything else and merging into one sort of universal app and service, that would be one thing. And I could see that. And I think that's kind of what Facebook's trying to do. Getting rid of Twitter, just carte blanche like that, is not good in my opinion. And
May,
I don't know.
maybe his 40 chess move is to totally kill Twitter, right? Like
Yeah,
society would
yeah,
be better without it. And that's,
maybe.
I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, but all I can say is if one good thing can come out of this branding, maybe he can totally redeem the letter X. Maybe he can drive out all of the quote unquote adult. I do want to say I don't like using the term adult for adult content because it's not adult content. It's childish content, really. Not in the term of actual age, but in terms of maturity. Just to be clear, I'm very much not against that. Don't treat it with adult because it's not worthy of respect. Um, but if he can drive all that out of business and totally make X, the SEO for X, go to this new Twitter alternative and totally destroy that association, then hey, good for him. That would be my golden nugget of this rebrand, maybe. All right. Without further ado, I think that's it for us. So thanks so much for listening to this episode. Just as a reminder to leave a comment, a like, a share, all that good stuff. It helps us out. And we'll see you on the next one. Take care.